Imagine waking up one morning and realizing the sun has changed. Not eclipsed, not hidden behind clouds. Changed, dim, cold, like a lamp turned down by an unseen hand. The day looks wrong, shadows are weak, the sky has a strange milky haze. And by noon, you're still shivering. You tell yourself it will pass by tomorrow, but tomorrow comes, and the sun is still sick. And then the crops begin to fail. The animals grow thin. Bread becomes precious. People start watching the sky the way they once watched the sea, as if the heavens themselves have turned hostile. Somewhere a priest says it is judgment. Somewhere a mother says it is hunger. Somewhere a ruler says it is temporary, and the empire will endure. But the darkness doesn't care what anyone says. In the year 536, the world slipped into a disaster so profound that historians would later call it the worst year to be alive, a catastrophe that didn't strike with a single battle or a single plague bell, but with a slow, suffocating collapse of light and warmth. A year when the sun went dark and the foundations of empires began to crack. It began quietly, the way the most terrifying things often do. There was no universal alarm, no single moment when everyone understood what was happening. In one village, a farmer simply noticed his seedlings weren't rising. In another, fishermen complained the wind felt wrong, like winter air lingering too long. In the cities, merchants argued about prices and blamed one another, because that's what people do when they can't blame the sky. But the sky was to blame. A Byzantine official named Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, for almost a full year. Not a week, not a month, a year. He wasn't writing poetry. He was writing like a man trying to describe something that shouldn't be possible. In Italy, a statesman named Cassiodorus wrote to reassure people because he had to. He described a sun that looked bluish, a sky that seemed muddied, shadows that nearly vanished at noon. He spoke of a world where you could stare at the sun and not squint, because it no longer burned the eyes. That detail should chill you. A sun you can look at. Think of what that does to the mind, to the soul. For most of human history, the sun wasn't just a star. It was a promise, a clock, a god, a witness, the guarantee that day would follow night and warmth would follow cold. Now that guarantee was breaking, and as the light failed, fear spread faster than any messenger. People began to tell stories, because stories are what we build when reality becomes unbearable. Some said a veil had been drawn across the heavens. Some said the end of days had begun. Some said distant wars had angered God. Others spoke of strange omens, blood-red sunsets, a lingering twilight, a pale disk hanging above the horizon like a dying ember. But the most frightening truth was simpler than any myth. The world was getting colder, not in a gentle way, not in the way of a late spring, cold that bit into summer, cold that ruined harvests, cold that turned rain into sleet, cold that made even the strongest men stare at their empty fields and understand, with a sinking certainty, that they were standing on the edge of famine. And famine, once it begins, is not a single event. It is a chain reaction. It is the slow collapse of ordinary life. First, you eat what you stored for winter. Then you ration. Then you dilute. Then you sell. Then you trade. Then you beg. Then you steal. Then you watch your neighbor do the same. Then you stop trusting anyone. Then you start locking doors. Then you start sleeping with a knife. Then you start making choices you swore you'd never make. Across Europe and the Mediterranean, harvests faltered. Grain yields dropped. Vineyards struggled. In Ireland, chronicles speak of a failure of bread in the years that followed. In China, records describe summer snow and widespread famine. In parts of the world, people watched frost form when it had no right to exist. The planet was cooling, and no one knew why. Today, we can look back with the cold clarity of science and see what they could not. Ice cores drilled from Greenland and Antarctica preserve microscopic evidence of massive volcanic eruptions around that time, scattering ash and sulfate aerosols into the upper atmosphere. Those aerosols can linger for months, even years, reflecting sunlight back into space. A volcanic winter. Not a metaphor, a mechanism. But in 536, no one had the luxury of mechanism. They had only consequences, and consequences arrived with ruthless precision. In Constantinople, the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, the streets still bustled. The empire still collected taxes. The emperor Justinian still dreamed of reconquering the West, of restoring Rome's old glory. The bureaucracy still stamped documents. The soldiers still drilled. The church bells still rang. But the empire was a living thing, and living things require food. Grain was the lifeblood of cities. When harvests failed or shipments faltered, hunger did not stay in the countryside. It moved into the markets. It climbed into the apartments. It crept into the palaces. And hunger changes politics. When people are full, they argue about doctrine, about borders, about pride. When people are starving, they argue about bread. And when bread becomes scarce, the legitimacy of rulers becomes scarce with it. Imagine a dock worker on the shores of the Bosporus. He has hauled sacks of grain for years. He knows the smell of wheat. He knows the rhythm of ships arriving. But now the sacks are fewer. The captains complain. The merchants whisper. The price rises. His wage doesn't. He goes home with less food. His children's faces look sharper. His wife starts cutting portions smaller. He hears rumors that the rich are hoarding. He hears rumors that the emperor is cursed. He hears rumors that God is angry. He doesn't know about volcanoes. He knows only that the sun looks wrong and his family's hungry. Multiply that man by millions. This is how civilizations begin to fracture. And then, as if darkness and cold were not enough, disease came. Not immediately in 536, but soon after, as weakened bodies and stressed societies became perfect fuel for contagion. In 541, the first great outbreak of what we now call the Justinianic plague erupted, likely arriving through trade routes from the east, carried in ships and in fleas, moving faster than fear. By the time it hit Constantinople, it was as if the world had decided to finish what the darkened sun had started. Procopius described the plague in horrifying detail. People developed swellings in the groin and armpits. Fever followed, delirium, death. In the city, the dead piled up faster than they could be buried. The living grew numb. The normal rituals of mourning broke down because there were too many bodies in too few hands. He wrote that at the height of it, thousands died every day. Even if the numbers are debated, the terror is not. Imagine the same dock worker, now older by a few years. He survived the hunger. He learned to stretch meals. He learned to endure. He thought the worst had passed. Then his neighbor collapses. Then another. Then his wife coughs and cannot stop. He goes to the church, but the priest is gone. He goes to the market, but the stalls are empty. He goes to the docks, but the ships are silent, quarantined by fear. He hears carts rolling at night, collecting bodies like refuse. He smells lime and smoke. He stops touching door handles with his bare hands. He stops letting his children play outside. And above it all, the sun still feels like a stranger. This is the cruel layering of catastrophe. Climate shock weakens harvests. Famine weakens bodies. Plague exploits weakness. And the social order buckles under the weight. The year 536 was not a single bad year. It was the opening act of a brutal era. For Justinian, the timing was disastrous. He was a man with imperial ambition, a ruler who believed history could be bent by willpower. His generals fought to reclaim Italy and North Africa. His officials tried to keep the empire's vast machine running, but machines break when the fuel runs out. War is expensive. Famine shrinks tax revenue. Plague kills taxpayers, soldiers, administrators, craftsmen. Supply lines falter. Recruitment collapses. Morale decays. And enemies, sensing weakness, press harder. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall in the 540s. It endured, battered but alive. Yet something changed in those years, something that never fully healed. The empire that emerged was more defensive, more strained, more haunted by the knowledge that nature itself could undo human plans. And the shockwaves did not stop at Byzantium's borders. Across the Mediterranean, the old Western Roman world had already fractured into kingdoms. Italy was a battlefield. Gaul was contested. Spain was shifting. Britain was a patchwork of warlords and struggling communities. In such a world, stability was thin, even in good times. These were not good times. A few degrees of cooling may not sound like much to us, living with central heating and global supply chains. But in an agrarian world, a small drop in temperature can mean the difference between a harvest and a hunger season, between survival and collapse, between a kingdom that pays its warriors and a kingdom that watches them turn into bandits. When grain fails, everything fails. Because grain is not just food, it is seed for next year, it is taxes, it is wages, it is trade, it is the foundation of armies. The darkness of 5 and 36 attacked that foundation directly. And so the world entered a period of instability that historians still try to measure, still try to name. Some call it the late antique Little Ice Age, a stretch of colder climate that followed the volcanic events of the mid-6th century. Not a single winter, but a climate regime, a long, grinding pressure on societies already stretched by war and politics. And while emperors and chroniclers wrote about omens, ordinary people lived them. Picture a small farm somewhere in the Balkans. A family has worked the same plot for generations. They know the soil. They know the seasons. They can smell rain before it comes. They can read the sky like a book. But now the book is written in a language they don't understand. Spring arrives late. Summer never warms properly. The grain heads stay small. The fruit trees blossom and then drop their blossoms. The family digs up roots, gathers wild greens, traps what animals they can. They slaughter livestock earlier than planned because they cannot feed them. They salt meat, but salt is expensive. They barter tools for flour. They argue in whispers at night about whether to leave. Leaving is dangerous. Staying is deadly. And so, slowly, people move. Not in one great migration, but in countless desperate decisions. Families abandoning farms, villagers walking towards cities that cannot feed them, bands of hungry men turning to raiding, borders becoming more violent, not because of grand strategy, but because hunger makes a weapon of every hand. This is how the fabric tears, and all the while the sky remains wrong. Modern science suggests at least one massive eruption in 536, possibly in the high latitudes of the northern hemisphere, followed by another in 540 and perhaps again later. The effect would have been cumulative. Sunlight reduced, summers cooler, growing seasons shorten. Tree rings from this period show stunted growth, a biological record of stress etched into wood. Trees do not exaggerate. Ice does not lie. But human beings trapped inside the event could only interpret through their beliefs. In some places, the darkness would have deepened religious fervor. In others, it would have sparked doubt. If the sun could fail, what else could fail? If the gods could not guarantee the seasons, what were they worth? And if rulers claimed divine favor, what did a dimmed sun say about them? It is tempting to imagine emperors and kings looking up and feeling fear like anyone else. But rulers have a special kind of fear, the fear that panic will spread, that markets will collapse, that soldiers will desert, that rivals will seize the moment. So they issue proclamations, they stage ceremonies, they distribute charity if they can, they punish hoarders. They blame enemies, they blame heretics, they blame foreigners, because admitting helplessness is politically fatal. Yet nature does not negotiate. The catastrophe of 536 was not a single villain you could execute, not an army you could defeat, not a treaty you could sign. It was the atmosphere itself turned against you, and that is why it was so psychologically devastating. You can fight a war, you can rebuild after an earthquake. You can even make sense of a plague by blaming someone, anyone. But how do you fight a dim sun? How do you arrest a sky? In the years after 536, the world's great systems of exchange and power began to shift in ways that were not always obvious at first. Trade networks faltered and then adapted. Some regions suffered more than others. Some communities proved resilient. Others vanished from the record, erased not by a single dramatic event, but by attrition. A village doesn't always fall. Sometimes it just empties. Sometimes a generation grows up smaller, weaker, fewer in number. Sometimes the old stories stop being told because the people who knew them are gone. And then, in the middle of this, the plague arrives like a final verdict. The Justinianic plague did not sweep through once and disappear. It returned in waves for centuries. It helped reshape the Mediterranean world, weakening the empire's ability to project power, altering labor systems, disrupting economies, and changing the rhythm of daily life. And it began in a world already wounded by darkness. When we talk about empires collapsing, we often picture dramatic scenes: a city on fire, a last emperor, a barbarian at the gate, but collapse is often quieter. It is a shortage, a delay, a missing shipment, a failed harvest, a tax collector who never comes back because he died on the road, a soldier whose pay is late, so he sells his sword, a farmer who plants less because he has less seed, a mother who buries a child and never fully returns to herself. Collapse is cumulative, and 536 was a year that made accumulation inevitable. There is another unsettling detail in the records. People noted the sun's strangeness, not only for its dimness but for its color, a bluish tint, a pale, ghostly light. That suggests aerosols scattering light in the atmosphere, turning the familiar into the uncanny. The world didn't just grow colder, it grew alien. And when the familiar becomes alien, societies become vulnerable to extremes. Superstition rises, scapegoating spreads, violence becomes easier. People cling harder to leaders who promise certainty, or they turn on those leaders when certainty fails. In that sense, the catastrophe of 536 was not only environmental, it was psychological. It trained entire populations to live with dread. Think of a child born in 536. Their earliest memories would be of dim summers, of adults whispering, of empty bowls, of prayers spoken with shaking hands. By the time they were 5, the plague might have arrived. By the time they were 10, they might have watched their community shrink, watched homes abandoned, watched the strong become desperate. That child would grow into an adult shaped by crisis, and that adult would raise children shaped by crisis. This is how an era changes, not just by what happens, but by what people come to expect. And all of this began with something as simple and as terrifying as a sun that would not shine properly. For centuries, the year 536 sat in the shadows of history. Chroniclers mentioned it, yes, but later generations often treated it as a curiosity, an omen in old texts. Only in recent decades has the full scale of the event come into focus, as scientists and historians compared notes across disciplines. Tree rings, ice cores, ancient chronicles, archaeology, different languages, different methods, the same story. Something happened in the mid-6th century that dimmed the world, and the consequences rippled outward, touching everything. It's important to understand what makes 536 so haunting. It's not just the darkness. It's the way it reveals the fragility of systems that seem permanent. Empires are built to look eternal. They carve their names into stone. They mint coins with faces that stare into the future. They build walls and aqueducts and churches and palaces, all meant to outlast the people who built them. But an empire is still, in the end, a network of humans eating food grown from soil under a sun. Dim the sun, chill the soil, shorten the growing season, and the most magnificent palace becomes a cold room filled with hungry people. In that sense, 536 is a reminder that history is not only made by generals and kings, it is made by weather, by microbes, by the thin, invisible layers of air that keep the world warm, and by the fact that those layers can change. If you could stand in 536 and look across the world, you would not see a single apocalyptic scene. You would see countless small tragedies: a fisherman returning with an empty net because the season shifted, a shepherd watching lambs die in an unexpected cold snap, a merchant counting fewer customers, a mother measuring flour with trembling fingers, a soldier feeling his strength fade because his rations have been cut again, and somewhere, in a palace, an emperor listening to reports that sound like excuses. The harvest is late, the grain is scarce, the people are restless, the sky is wrong. What do you do with that? You can send armies. You can issue decrees, you can pray, but you cannot order the sun to brighten. You cannot threaten the cold into retreat. You cannot tax the atmosphere into compliance. So you do what humans always do when faced with the uncontrollable. You adapt or you break. Some adapted. Communities shifted crops. Trade routes changed. Power centers moved. New religious movements gained strength. Old assumptions were questioned. In the long arc of history, the world did not end in 536, but a world did end. The late antique world, with its old Roman rhythms and its Mediterranean unity, began to transform into something else. More regional, more fragmented, more hardened. The centuries that followed would be shaped by new powers, new faiths, new borders. And beneath those changes, like a hidden foundation, was the memory of years when nature turned against human expectation. There is a final, uncomfortable thought. The people of 536 had no warning, no satellite images, no climate models, no global communication, no ability to look at the sky's chemistry and understand what was happening. They were trapped inside the event, interpreting it through fear and faith, trying to survive one day at a time. We are not as blind. We can read the planet's archives. We can detect patterns. We can measure aerosols and temperatures and ocean currents. We can see how interconnected our systems are, how a shock in one place cascades into shortages, unrest, migration, conflict. And yet, for all our knowledge, we still live under the same sun. We still rely on harvests, on supply chains, on the invisible stability of climate, on the assumption that tomorrow will look like today. The catastrophe of 536 whispers across time that this assumption is a luxury. It tells us that the line between normal life and systemic crisis can be thinner than anyone wants to admit, that the world can change not only through human decisions, but through forces indifferent to human plans. A volcano erupts and the sky dims. A summer turns cold and the fields fail. A society weakens and disease finds its opening. An empire that seemed unshakable begins to wobble, not because of one enemy at the gate, but because the sun itself feels wrong. So when we look back at 536, we're not just staring into an ancient disaster. We're looking into a mirror that reflects our own vulnerability. The people of that year stood under a darkened sun and tried to make sense of it. They argued, they prayed, they blamed, they endured, they broke, they rebuilt. They passed down stories of a time when daylight lost its strength, and we, centuries later, can finally name the likely cause. But naming it doesn't remove the lesson, because the most frightening part of 536 is not that it happened, it's that it can happen. And when it does, it won't ask whether our empires are ready. It won't care what we believe. It won't pause for our politics or our pride. It will simply dim the light, and we will find out, as they did, what remains when the sun goes dark.
If you liked this video, please hit the like and subscribe button for more.